just to kind of continue on from last video about trying something new and not really knowing how to respond to any of the feedback that you might get, and how, like, I started the video talking about jinn, and before that it was almost like, if we aren't really sure of what the difference is between a cult and religion, how are we supposed to know without almost trying? And then understanding something about God's forgiving nature, which is he's almost allowing us to be in the world with kind of like a trial and error almost attitude about the world, so that, if there's something that's contentious, we can almost have the resources available to us to kind of figure out, well, what can I do and what can I ask and who can I ask, and what's kind of like a process of elimination that I can kind of work with, or like a research method, for example, that I can work with to help me arrive at a certain conclusion. And then what is it that I'm trying to find out at the end of all this? So, for example, the kind of progression that I'm working with right now is going from a postmodern lens to a little bit about how to understand the family, and then what is it about the attributes of God and different representations of God, and how popular culture kind of helps us understand or can almost undermine what we understand of God. And now it's almost like, well, how can we support ourselves in including all of that to building new ideas of how to understand God? So I'm taking a step back a little bit from using the word God and jinn and just these different kind of representations of otherworldly beings, as it were, and just kind of say, what if we just assume, and we'll assume correctly, that if we try to understand something with like an honest intention of, I just want to have a healthy understanding of the universe so that I can build my life into kind of spiritual meaning that's going to help me live and end my life in a healthy way, so that I can almost invite myself into the world in some kind of happy circumstance, then what is it that I can do to kind of perpetuate that and continue that forward cycle in kind of like a chronologically healthy momentum, as it were? So if we talked about God, we talked about jinn, we talked about kind of trial and error with what society might assume is like good and bad, and then if we think, okay, I'm going to go back to all of the beginning, like all of that, and then keep it all in my mind, and then think, okay, before that I have God, and he describes himself first and foremost as the compassionate. So I think compassion, and I think, well, that's kind of like a mother and child, which is, I don't see any harm in any of that kind of relationship. It's usually like I'm doing everything, like I'm sacrificing everything for my own well-being to kind of give to this child so it can survive. So you think, how can I really go wrong? And the answer is, you can't. Like, you can only improve your situation. What you actually have to worry about is what signs do I know how to read to almost help me pause, so that I can know when to maybe almost find a different path, or augment it with something else, or supplement it with something else. So knowing this, you can almost understand, well, that kind of tells me that there's forgiveness in the world. So there's compassion and there's forgiveness, which means you can try, you'll be forgiven, and you almost have to have this, it's like a way of almost building up constantly around how to almost elevate yourself in the world. So it's almost like there's a song, I think it's by Led Zeppelin, it's called the Stairway to Heaven. I don't remember the exact lyrics of it, but I love the depiction of it, which it's almost kind of suggesting that with each successive life, and it seems like that as a kind of like a global phenomenon, like as we go through different civilizations and different kind of global geographies, that we are all kind of progressing to a higher way of thinking. My dad always used to say, if we were to think of like the richest king maybe 2,000 years ago, right now any person can say that they're living better than what that king was, like who's middle class even. So it's almost to say we are kind of progressing in a way that we're building our own idea of what heaven could be. So what would happen if we could live our life to kind of build it as though, if I was to die right now, it would be okay, because I know that when I wake up in my next life, I'll kind of like where I am in the world, or what I'm trying to kind of work towards. So it's almost like, because my intention is to build a healthy relationship, if I die in the middle of that, hopefully I'll be born into a family that helps me understand, how to build healthy relationships, and then you continue in that way. So one narration that I really love is, well, there's two of them actually. One of them is the prophet. He used to love to give examples of just natural phenomenon, which kind of reinforces what he understood from the archangel as learn to read the universe. Like, it doesn't have to be actually written text. It can be just try to be inspired by what you see in your surroundings. So he once saw a mother nursing a child, and he said to his companions, like, would you ever see this mother throwing her child in the fire? And then the companions were like, no. And so he said, verily, almost as though to like swear by the fact that God is more merciful to us as humans, like a collective, than a mother is to her child. It's almost to say, like, you can't lose hope in God. Like, to despair in God is almost like you're actually doing yourself an injustice. Like, that would be maybe in God's eyes as like unforgivable, almost like he just keeps reinforcing his compassion and his mercy and his forgiveness to the point that it's like, why would you despair? So you kind of have to kind of take a step back and say, well, then why are there hardships in the world? And that's kind of what can drive somebody to find a spiritual path and to almost understand, like, what can I look at in the past that's going to help me understand positive meanings that aren't going to be so rigid or so rule driven that it kind of takes me to a conservative path that takes away from whatever creates kind of like a spirited, fulfilling life. So the other kind of narration that I want to kind of align this with is there's this kind of like depiction or this illustration of a narrative where God goes through all of humanity, and he's giving everybody almost like a rendition of what their actions are. And it's almost to say that, they all spend so much time like in difficulty or in suffering. You can say in hell, as it were, but it's not really, you don't have to imagine it as a place. But anyway, and as he's doing this, people are almost working off their maybe misguided beliefs or whatever it is they had to work off to kind of end their suffering, and then they can find a place in heaven. So it gets to this last person where they're almost like, when you're like, we used to do this in high school or even in grade school, where it's a gym class, and then the teacher will pick like two captains and say, okay, and then everybody pick a person to be on their team, and then by the end there's usually this one person who's always left at the end. And sometimes if there's an odd pairing and even pairing, it just becomes like, I don't know what to do with this last person. This is usually also kind of a scenario that when you have to pair off into projects and there ends up being an odd person out. So it's almost that feeling of like disappointment where you're just like, man, I'm always the last person. So that's the kind of imagery that's given, where it's just this one person who's almost like they want to look back and be like, they don't want to lose hope in God. Like, God, like, you're going to forget about me? So the story goes on that, or the narration says that God almost like asks the person, like, in almost like an inquisitive way, like, you don't have a question for me? He's like, yeah, like, I had hope that, you'd forgive me. And that's basically God saying, like, of course I will. Like, it's not going to be this endless torture, this endless suffering of, well, you could never get it right. And therefore, you're just stuck by yourself, like isolated or anything like that. So the story to me always spoke of an understanding of, we get to that point where we're just ready to just give up. And for me, from my own experience, it's always at that moment where I'm like, I give up. And then like something will just happen. I'll be like, oh, it's like I almost had to give up to have like this kind of like enlightened moment, or this light bulb moment kind of flash, and just be like, oh, okay, maybe I'm just trying too hard. Which kind of goes back to what I'm understanding about the divine providence and grace, in a way, where sometimes we put so much emphasis on our own know-how and our own kind of almost, I mean, it's good to have self-esteem, but we kind of have this perception of ourselves and what our talents and skills are, that we almost forget to be grateful that, we're chosen for this specific kind of gift, as it were. And like having these moments of frustration or stress, or like these brick walls, or almost blocks or obstacles in a way, are sometimes a good reminder that we should maybe take a moment back and just say, maybe this is a good reminder to kind of humble me, that in the grand scheme of things, even myself, I can't really rely on, and it's almost a good thing, that be it like, you know, a really euphoric moment of like I did something that was really great, I should be grateful. And even if I'm like really really stuck in the like the darkest of moments, I should still remember to try to be grateful, even if, you know, it's after I've had a meltdown and had a maybe some conflagration of some kind. Just remembering that point of, you know, gratitude, and um, there's always going to be ease after whatever hardship it is you're enduring, gives us that kind of renewed sense of purpose and hope that ends up having kind of like an overall positive incline, rather than, you know, something that looks like it's always just going downhill. If you kind of catch yourself before thinking like it's just going to be this endless dip, eventually, hopefully the curve will go back to an incline that's a positive climb.